Whatever you say nothing when you talk about you know what. For if you know should hear you, you know what you'll get. They'll take you off to you know where, and you wouldn't know how long. So for you know whose sake, don't let anyone hear you singing this song. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, study that war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study the war no more. Ain't gonna study that war no. Study the war no more. My father drove me down to my 5th induction. I had delayed and resisted the first 4 inductions until the Army made me an offer I could not refuse. Either accept your next induction, or we will treat you to an all-expense-paid vacation in Fort Leavenworth Federal Prison for 3 to 5 years. When the government wields that kind of power, you got to dance like a matador without a sword. My father was in favor of the Vietnam War, and like many warmongers of that time, he never served a day in the military. What I call a chicken hawk. He had a deferment for being on the New York City Police Department for the entire duration of World War II and the Korean conflict. He liked the idea of war, as long as he did not have to fight in it. My 5th induction went smoothly. I walked comatose through what I accepted as the inevitable, leading to the unpredictable. I had no idea where I was going. It was September 27th, 1966. My first night in the Army was in Fort Jackson, South Carolina. 100 recruits were left to their own devices in a wooden barracks that was built as temporary in 1914. A potbelly stove was its only source of heat. The temperature plummeted into the low 40s, and soon this band of strangers was united in search for raw materials. All they had on their bunks were lace-thin, olive-drab woolen blankets from World War II. Wood scraps and paper appeared from their searches, indoors and out, and we had liftoff. Some of the donations from the great outdoors were a little wet, and they hissed and cracked and popped a bit. Within minutes, you were lucky if you were 5-6 bunks away from the stove. Within minutes, it was glowing beyond red into white hot and putting out some serious BTUs. Some thought it would explode. I thought, what welcome bone-melting heat it was, and fell off to sleep. It seemed like only seconds passed. Out of the black and blue, someone in a funny hat, the Army's version of a baseball hat, was yelling so loudly it hurt. On your feet! On your feet! Attend! Hut! Get your asses out of those beds. I'll slap you upside your head. I'll hit you so hard and fast you think your daddy kicked your ass. On your feet! Attend! Hut! Everybody struggled to get up and do their best imitation of attention. Seen in the war movies we were weaned on. We were F Company, 250 New Yorkers and 20 Southerners. It was hard to tell who would soon be more confused by the mutual culture shock, the New Yorker privates or their redneck Southern sergeants. The day before, this motley crew of draftees had been herded into a bus that took us from Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn, to Penn Station in Manhattan, where we boarded an express train to Fort Jackson, Columbia, South Carolina. It seemed like an eternity, but I'm told it was only a 14-hour trip. Driven by curiosity and boredom, I was conned into joining a poker game with my fellow soldiers. I was never any good at playing cards, especially for money. Maybe it was the peer pressure to do something to fit into a group I knew I was soon going to be unfit for, the military. I'd play along until they found out I was born not to conform. It was bound to surface sooner or later. I got fleeced for about $30, which wasn't bad in the long run. My frugality made that an easy lesson to remember. I didn't play cards for money for decades after that. But I did have an immediate problem. I would have no money until my Uncle Sam gave me $94, but only after I toiled in his vineyard for a month. In desperation, I called my father. Collect. I didn't tell him how I lost the money, but that I was broke and needed a short-term infusion of cash. He said, "I'll send you a money order. The next time you communicate, Terence, write. Don't call." The next sound I heard was a dial tone. I'm going down to my boot camp now on the Carolina side, on the Carolina side, on the Carolina side, going down to my boot camp now, down the Carolina side, but I ain't going to Vietnam. No, I ain't gonna Vietnam. No, I ain't gonna Vietnam. Ain't going to Vietnam, down to Vietnam. My story for you today is called The Boot Camp Mile. But instead of singing a song, I'm going to start with a poem of my own called On Our Own. We are all on our own, from the cradle to the grave. My disposition made me misbehave. I was born to be someone like me. I was told as a boy, don't talk back, don't make noise, don't you sass, don't you flounce, and do not give us lip. But I would not bow down to the whip. I had a big old father who it didn't seem to bother to hit a small child with a fist. Now, I'm no genius at math, but that is energy plus mass. And while you're flying through the air, you get the gist. It's just not fair. We are all on our own, from the cradle to the grave. My disposition made me disbehave by the standards of those days. Set in stone by church and state, to repeat the crimes their fathers made upon their sons, conform, or pay the price exacted daily for not following the norm. As I started boot camp, I was a 19-year-old kid with a strong rebel streak. I'd strike out at any authority that did not care about empathy. I had survived 18 years under my father's dictatorial boot camp-like abuse at home by passive-aggressive resistance and satire. Years later, all my shrinks agreed I had PTSD before I was 13. I was a funny kid, doing imitations of nuns after they beat me, trying to make them seem sillier instead of scarier. I was laughing just to keep from crying. I had all the rebellion and risk-oblivious behavior that is typical when a rebel kid strikes back at a monster dad. My youth was a string of Pyrrhic victories. My dad started beating me at 5 years of age, just like the Marist brothers at his boarding school beat him in the name of Jesus when he was a boy. Later, my dad would go to Mass every day, go to work as a cop, NYPD, then come home and beat the wife and kids. Mom was 4'11", 85 pounds. He was 6'2", and about 220. When they drafted me into the Army, I said, oh no, here we go again. The only difference between the Army officers and my father was just different uniforms. And just like my father, I would give them the same respect they gave me. None. As they treated everyone under their control unfairly, I assumed the golden rule applied, and they should expect no respect from me. The Army ended boot camp with a 3-day physical, and that had a 500-point total. You needed 400 points to pass. As usual, my goofing off backfired on me. I did not pay attention to how far behind I was on those points. On the last day, I had only 300 points, so I needed to run a mile under 5 minutes and 30 seconds, which was worth 100 points, to be graduated, or I would have to spend another 10 weeks in boot camp. But I was a miler on the track team in high school. I had run 4:43 when I was 13 years old, and many miles under 5 minutes in my teens. Everybody in my company had already scored 400 points, leaving me to be the only one who needed to run the mile under 5:30. The company exec officer, Lieutenant Kirk, was really pissed because he thought it was a wasted time. He insisted I was going to fail and just repeat spending the entire 10 weeks in basic training, boot camp. I knew I could run well under 5:30, even with my Army dress wingtips, which was all that was available to me. Dressed in my olive drab shorts and t-shirt and my dress shoes, I looked like an upper-class twit in a Monty Python skit. Dressed like a candidate for the Department of Silly Walks, all I needed was a bowler and a bumper chute. Lieutenant Kirk held the stopwatch aloft and said, "Ready, set, go!" I shot off the mark and fell into my distance runner's trance, the 75-second quarter mile etched somewhere in my muscle memory. I hit the first turn at a solid clip and found the first slip of my trip. The soles of my Army dress shoes were smooth. They slid on the loose cinder track. I dug my heels in on the turn until the straightaway. I then remembered a primer I had read about distance running so long ago. Heel toe, easy as you go, heel toe. As long as I concentrated on the heel landing, hard and the toe lightly. I got my traction going and my momentum flowing. Before I knew it, I saw Lieutenant Kirk at the side of the track, shouting, 72! That meant I finished my first lap right on time, a little under a 5-minute mile pace. The slick shoes were not helping my grip on the cinders, but I realized they were getting so scuffed up on the soles I wasn't sliding as much on the last 2 turns. Time to stop thinking and just run what I know is a good pace. Here's Lieutenant Kirk again, with my second lap split. 2:20. Okay, Sullivan, you can stop running now. You proved your point. The last part of what he said faded as I swung into the turn of my 3rd quarter mile. Without sliding anymore, heel toe, heel toe. Now it's time to pick up a few steps, but carefully, hitting the heel squarely. My mouth feels like flannel and mud. No one has run on this track for ages, and I'm eating the cinder dust I'm kicking up. Don't think about your mouth. Just run. Oh, shit. Here's Lieutenant Kirk again. 3:40, he yelled. Pull up, Private. You don't have to run anymore, Kirk says, trying to save face. He knows at this pace I'll be well under 5. His voice fades in the clouds of cinder dust. I ignore him and keep running. 3:40, shit. I slowed down with all that thinking and talking to myself. Maybe I'm sliding more than I think. Careful. Just find your 5-minute pace and hold on to it. That cinder dust tastes like nasty chemicals. Shut up. It's the last turn. Time to bring it home. You're a miler, damn it. Let's kick it in, motherfucker. My stride opens up, feet more than I've been running. As I cross the finish line, I'm falling to the left, flailing my arms to keep from going down. As I pass the finish line, I hit the wooden rail on the side of the track with my left foot, and I crash into Sergeant Cepeda, who keeps me from falling down. Drenched with sweat and choking, bending over with exhaustion, I hear, 5:50. What? I shouted at Lieutenant Kirk. Let me see the stopwatch. You just added a minute to my time. Give me the watch. I yelled. He was 6 feet away from me and held up the watch, and as he did, he cleared my time. You don't know how to read a fucking stopwatch. Now you erase the time, I shouted. He saw I was losing my temper and stepped back. All 250 troops were standing at attention, watching us when I snapped to attention, but instead of an American salute, I stomped my right foot like a Scots Highlander sergeant and gave him one of those British army salutes that looks like it's attached to a giant spring. With a Scots accent I stole from Alec Guinness from Tunes of Glory, I hissed, Sir, you're a bloody liar and a cheat. I spun 180-degree about face and walked away, leaving him and the other troops on the parade grounds. Then I headed back to the barracks. He reported me to the colonel, who listened to my story and asked me why he shouldn't believe the lieutenant's version. I said, let me go back on the track, and I'll repeat the same time for the mile right now, sir, and it will be at least 1 minute faster than your lieutenant said it was. They didn't dare put me back on the track to prove the lieutenant was wrong. But they gave me the 100 points for the mile and graduated me out of boot camp. They just passed me off like a bad penny to the next training camp to be their problem. Let them try to straighten me out. Fat chance. The colonel knew the lieutenant gave me a raw deal. But they fined me $90 for insubordination. One more Pyrrhic victory. Sergeant Woodley. Master Sergeant Woodley was our platoon sergeant and drill instructor for the entire company when we did dismounted drill for attached bayonets. His hands and arms were simian. I remember him leaning against a tent pole, which was a 4x4 planed into an octagon, and his fingers nearly touched thumb to index as he grasped the pole. This at first does not seem impressive, but take your fingers, leave a ½ inch gap between your thumb and your index, and see how little cubic matter would be gathered there. His is a 4x4 in there. If and when he stood at attention, his arms didn't stop. They kept on going down his legs till they got to his knees, where his thumbs laid against his seams, about the kneecap. Now, take those hands and wrap them around a rifle stock of an M1, a standard 11-pound bolt-action rifle, and lift that M1 in the air, and now double it. 2 M1s, standard. Sergeant Woodley would train us raw recruits for 45 minutes straight, holding 2 M1 rifles over his head for that whole lesson, shouting, "The purpose of the bayonet? To kill, Sergeant!" The chorus of recruits would reply. Off that drill tarmac, he did not shout a syllable. He did not need to. He was scary or quiet, and he knew it. And it was a comical contrast every morning to see his buck sergeant, Barkley, as he took charge of the platoon to march us off to the mess hall. As soon as he would salute Sergeant Woodley and drop it from his temple, he spun 90 degrees shouting orders to us, his lowly private E1s. We were the single-cell animals of the Army swamp. It was like Barney Fife taking over Mayberry while Andy Griffith went fishing. Sergeant Barkley was about 5'7" with a nasal, high-tenor speaking voice, and his shouting pitched it up just a touch more, while Sergeant Woodley was about 6'3", with a baritone range that had mumbles so low only whales understood them. One sunny afternoon, while Sergeant Woodley was mumbling along, it had an almost reassuring hum to it. I wasn't listening to the words, which always got me in Dutch at school. Sergeant Woodley was teaching the half-step, side-step march. The classroom for this drill was a half-mile wide asphalt parking lot, long enough to make mirages that wobble the horizon on a warm day. A warm day in Columbia, South Carolina, home to Fort Jackson, was odd in that it started at 35 degrees at 5 a.m. and hit 80 by noon. So with Sergeant Woodley droning on and it close to 80 degrees and the platoon still dressed for 35 degrees, there was a whole lot of sweating going on. Sergeant Woodley seemed to enjoy the sweating while I was dizzy, steaming up my fatigues. We were trying to learn this half-step and side-step march, but whenever it got really hot, I tend to lose my concentration. It's like they say in Brooklyn, it's not the heat, it's the stupidity. Side-step march is useful when adjusting large formations of men to line them up perfectly, to remind you you're only little tin toy soldiers to those in charge. to be moved around like little pawns. For instance, one platoon has a gap of 12 feet between it and the next platoon, but the next 3 platoons have a gap between each of only 11 feet. What you do with the platoon with the 12-foot gap, you bring the boys to attention and shout, "Sidestep! Halt! 1, 2, halt!" And if they followed you properly, the whole platoon should have moved 12 inches, and all the gaps would be equal, unless all the other platoons thought you were talking to them, and they moved that 12 inches. Hell, you could spend the entire day chasing the other platoons around the parade ground. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that some silly, sadistic drill sergeant did just that. Martinets love to drill you till you drop. What did happen was strange enough. I was sweating bullets along with everyone else with a 19-year-old metabolism and good circulation, the whole platoon. We were practicing our sidestep march drill on one of the largest pieces of asphalt I've ever seen. And there were platoons more than a quarter of a mile away on that same slab of tar. Soon, I swooned into comatose level daydreaming. Sergeant Woodley was humming along, and the heat was causing mirage ripples on the horizon line on the old drill grounds. 1/4 mile away, one solitary platoon was marching left to right. They had become a single form that I transformed into an enormous caterpillar, its head and body bobbing slightly, throbbing lightly, waving to me. As I was about to wave back, I heard my name. "Sullivan! Get your head out of your ass, young man, or I'll kick your dumb ass off your shoulders." Sergeant Woodley was standing right in front of me, and he's raising his voice. It's the first time I've ever heard him raise his voice, and it sounds like my fucking father. I haven't fully digested the lesson yet that sergeants can't hit you, so I'm scared shitless. I look to my left and I see why the sergeant is so pissed. The rest of the platoon is 15 yards away. And that must have taken a while and some deep daydreaming, because they got there by half-step march, which is about 6 inches to the step. I'm too tired, you do the math. I felt something wet on my face, and it wasn't sweat. I realized the sergeant just pushed some good old-fashioned fear buttons from my early childhood. Many years after this incident, I would recall those buttons in a poem song about my childhood. My childhood smelled of fear, of punishment unfair. It rained inside, land where my mother cried, fearful of homicide. Go on, call the cops on a cop. One more hopeless trap. There I was again in one more hopeless trap. Sergeant Woodley said, sotto voce, "Wipe your face off with your sleeve before you return the platoon." "I'm sorry, Sergeant, I saw this platoon, this caterpillar out there, and son, don't make this worse than it already is." Then the sergeant's voice started rising in volume, but as if to the platoon in general. "All y'all better start paying attention. When you get over there, somebody's gonna blow your head off, where there ain't no feckin' time for daydreaming. Now get your head out of your ass and join the other girls." This last part was said a little louder so everybody got the message that daydreaming was a civilian luxury, not allowed in this girls' army. I can still do a decent sidestep march some 50 years later, but I'm a much better daydreamer. Whatever you say nothing when you talk about you know what. For if you know should hear you, you know what you'll get. They'll take you off to you know where, and you wouldn't know how long. So for you know whose sake, don't let anyone hear you singing this song.